Hello, everyone. Welcome to session 5, the last session of the day on assessing AI fit and function. I think this is going to be a fantastic session. I'm going to introduce our first speaker. I forgot to introduce myself. I'm AJ Holmgren. I'm an assistant professor at UCSF, and I'll be moderating the session today. Our first speaker is Jean Feng, an assistant professor of epidemiology and biostatistics at UCSF.
All right, thanks for having me. Okay, I've been a bit sick, but you guys can still hear me, right? Okay, I'll keep my mask on then. Okay, so I'm going to talk about post-market monitoring of AI-based medical devices. And so probably by now, none of us are surprised we need to be monitoring AI algorithms. Here's just one example. Here's a model for predicting ED admissions. Prior to COVID-19, that AUC is 0.85. Once the pandemic hit, that AUC is dropping pretty precipitously. And that was a tabular model that generative AI models experienced similar things. So here's a paper out of Berkeley and Stanford where they were looking at ChatGPT's behavior. And these performance changes were occurring primarily because the model was being updated. So for a question like, is 17077 a prime number? 1 month, its accuracy could be close to 100%, and the next month it can drop to something like 2%. And so this has prompted regulators to think about, well, we should probably institute some good machine learning practices. So this was a document produced by the FDA, Health Canada, MHRA in 2021 that said, okay, here are 10 guiding principles, and one of them is you need to be monitoring your models. And so our group has been thinking about monitoring for a while, monitoring and model updating. And the first question we wanted to ask is, well, what can hospitals do right now? Like what tools do we have at our disposal that can put us it can prep us for what's potentially going to happen. And so this led us to write a review paper that really connected like model monitoring with quality assurance or QA and model updating with quality improvement and QI. And the reason making this connection was particularly important to us is that hospitals already have QA and QI units. Hospitals already monitor patient outcomes, they monitor hospital processes, and some of those toolings, or at least that infrastructure, could be repurposed also for the use of AI algorithms. And of course, there's also just this vast toolbox that already exists in this field that has existed for a while now, since the 1960s. Toyota uses it to manufacture great cars. CDC also uses it to monitor, to conduct public surveillance on flus and whatnot. And so having these types of tools is really helpful. So like on the quality assurance side, you have monitoring algorithms like QSUM, UMI, sequential change weight detection, where you're monitoring these types of plots. And then when it spikes, you fire an alarm and you say, okay, time to take a look. And on the quality improvement side, we have tools like online hypothesis testing, such that if you're going to accumulate model updates over time, we want to make sure that overall these errors don't accumulate such that you accidentally accept a bad model update. Okay, so this is great. So our conclusion was there are some tools for monitoring AI. Of course, there are still improvements to be made, and there are special things in clinical AI where we need to make some adjustments. But more recently, we've been wondering about the question of, there's a lot of ways to configure monitoring algorithms, and how do hospitals actually put all of that together into a comprehensive monitoring system? And so we were scratching our heads because there's a lot of things you could possibly monitor in a hospital. There's a lot of, like, you can monitor the machine learning performance, but you could also monitor the inputs, the outputs, patient outcomes. So the number of choices just for monitoring criteria is quite large. And then there's the data source. Do you want observational data? Do you want interventional data? How much data do you have? So there's a lot of options there. And then also like which statistical methods do you want to use? And so you can just see these 3 decision points, I'm sure there are many more, already give you a multitude of monitoring procedures to choose from. And there are some theoretical ways to maybe try to choose among them, but there's also a lot of practical considerations that lead to how you make those decisions. And so we decided to conduct basically another review that said, well, how do we do that today? how do we make those decisions? So we did a systematic review going through the literature of monitoring systems for clinical AI algorithms. And we recovered something like only a handful of papers, honestly. A little more than half of them are more like conceptual papers that describe like how you would put together a framework. And then the remaining papers were actually describing real world monitoring systems that are in place right now. And when it comes to which monitoring criteria they recommend or actually monitor, the framework papers basically tell you monitor everything and the kitchen sink, which is somewhat unsurprising. So it's like monitor the metadata, the model inputs, user feedback, subgroups, clinical outcomes, so on and so forth. But when it comes to real world monitoring systems, there's a lot of practical kind of constraints. You don't have access to potentially the data you actually want. And so usually you only pick like 3 or 4 of them that you can reasonably do. And there's also questions of like how much manpower do you have to actually implement these monitoring pipelines in the first place. And then when it comes to monitoring data, unsurprisingly, basically all these papers chose observational because it is much easier to collect. And then some of them will acknowledge biases. Adjustment is a totally different and very difficult question that usually is swept under the rug. And when it comes to metadata, that was actually a bit surprising to us because very few papers talked about the sample size. And so you'd end up with plots that look something like this. They'd plot something like, okay, this is our AUC per month. We're going to monitor just like those confidence bands. And then if something goes outside the reasonable band, then like we're going to fire an alarm. But if your sample sizes are very small, you end up with something like this that ranges from 0.6 AUC to 1. And it's like, well, you might not have enough sample size to actually do this, or the method you're using might not have enough power to actually detect deviations. And so when it comes to statistical methods, we kind of see something similar. Usually the choice is something like a Shewhart chart that shows like, what is my performance metric per month? And very few papers talk about, well, let's try to borrow information across months or across whatever interval period you're trying to do so that we have increased statistical power to actually find those changes. And so what I guess I'm trying to drive home here, which is probably apparent to you at this point, is that what we really don't know about the monitoring procedures that we have in place today is that we don't know their operating characteristics, or what I refer to as operating characteristics, which means the performance characteristics of our monitoring systems themselves. Just because you have one doesn't mean necessarily it's working. So there are 2 aspects that define the operating characteristics of a monitoring system. One is how fast can you detect things when they go wrong? And the second one is how fast do you fire a false alarm? Or how often do you fire a false alarm? Because if it fires too frequently, you end up ignoring it, and there's alarm fatigue that comes with it as well. And across the suite of decisions that you need to make, those have varying impacts on your operating characteristics, and it's important to know about them. So across different data settings, across different choices, your operating characteristics can differ quite a bit. And it's worth running simulation studies or some sort of evaluation so that you know to some extent what the operating characteristics are for your monitoring system. And so just kind of to conclude here, how are we making decisions today? Well, I think having an AI monitoring system in place is a very important first step. And I think hospitals should be commended for their efforts to actually get one in place. It is not easy to make a monitoring system by any means. But the decisions we're making today are primarily driven by convenience. And what we can hope to achieve in the future is that we incorporate well-known like experimental design principles into our monitoring systems, where we might try to explore candidate configurations, understand like what the practical trade-offs are, even if it might cost more, even if it's more difficult to put in place, like what would how much more power would we potentially gain, and think about all those trade-offs. And so this led to our final set of recommendations that was published in NEJM AI this year, where we kind of listed out kind of the steps that we think is required to design a good AI monitoring system, starting from what those potential risks are, finding what those matching monitoring criteria are, data sources, statistical tests, and then exploring all those candidate configurations to finally come together as a team to decide how do you assemble that monitoring system that makes sense for your hospital. All right, I want to thank my collaborators.
Thank you very much for that fantastic talk and for staying perfectly on time as well. Our next speaker is Irene Chen, who is an assistant professor in the UCSF UC Berkeley Joint Program in Computational Precision Health. Irene, take it away.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm thrilled to be the last session of the day, everything holding you between mingling and more socializing. But let's talk today about the evaluation illusion of large language models in medicine. The promise of foundation models in medicine is that it will improve patient care, it will help hospital and administrative workflows, perhaps through education, and it will accelerate research. And one of the ways that this is manifested is through impressive results on things like US medical licensing exam results, as seen here. The line is going up and to the right. Buoyed by all the success, large language models are now being deployed in the clinic. Some of you are probably intimately familiar with this, but for those who aren't, according to a recent survey of UK physicians, 1 in 5 respondents said that they're using generative AI on a regular basis in their clinical practice, and 28% said they were using it for differential diagnosis versus 25% said they were using it for more treatment options. So not is it only accelerating clinical workflows, it is also specifically being used for patient care. In my own research, we're starting to use LLMs to improve health equity. So this is another angle that it could be quite useful in. For example, identifying treatment protocols for things like contraceptives, as well as exploring the impact of social determinants of health in liver transplants. But when we take a step back and we start to examine the whole area, the whole landscape of the field, it's becoming clear that large language models in medicine, we are not really sure when it's working and how it might be useful. So for example, a review article in October 2024 found that 5% of medical LLM papers were actually using real patient data. The vast majority of them are using, say, sanitized case study reports that include the entire clinical history of the patient and are well formatted, very unlike, say, the actual clinical notes taken by a physician. And in fact, most of the studies then focused on question answering. So something that is a clear thing that they're asking and a clear answer that they're looking for in response. This is not a great representation then, as I showed, from how actual patient care might be influenced and how we might expect large language models to be doing. And something I'd like to sort of plant a seed of skepticism in your mind today is to think about how will we actually know if and when medical LLMs are working if we're only evaluating them on very clean and sanitized settings. So part of the way to address this is through benchmarking. For example, this is MedHelm, a recently announced benchmarking that focuses only on electronic health records. It's got, 5 categories, 22 subcategories, 121 distinct clinical tasks on both public and private gated access datasets. And part of the project here is that each benchmark question has a correct answer. The answer could be an exact answer. For example, what is the diagnosis here? Or it could be more open-ended. It could be summarize this note in something that we would want, or it could be what are the reasons this person is looking for care. When it is open-ended, it's a little bit harder to evaluate. You're not just looking for one answer. You're not just asking, what is this patient's date of birth? You have a wide variety of things that the large language model could output. Traditionally, it's a little bit trickier to figure out how we might evaluate this at an automated scale. Certainly, we could hire clinicians to annotate and say, oh, this large language model response is good and bad. I've done it. Other folks have likely done it as well. It is very time consuming and is not very scalable at all. Instead, clinicians, computer scientists, statisticians, all kinds of folks will use automated scores. This one is called the BERT score. Not at all related to the Sesame Street character, but it happens to work out that way. Here, You could take two strings, pieces of text, for example, the weather is cold today and it is freezing today, and using a representation, like BERT, you can calculate, say, the cosine similarity to see how close these two strings are together. And because the model knows basically that cold and freezing are similar, then it'll say have a high similarity. We might expect then that if we wanted to evaluate how the large language model is doing, we could also stick in things like pneumothorax and collapsed lung, which are the same thing, but because they don't have any overlapping words, the model should still know that. The problem is that we are not really sure if BERT knows clinical things. And also, the second point is that when you have longer responses, for example, sentences and sentences, it's been shown that BERT score can start to distort a little bit, and the idea of something being close or far apart gets distorted as well. So in our study, we went and looked at, well, these automated metrics are good for things. We can do it at large scale. We can start to do benchmarking. This would be really helpful if it worked. Do they actually work? So we went through on the order of 10 to 20 different studies, and we looked at how they did medical summarization. So different studies have looked at large language models to summarize medical tasks. And we found that across all of these studies, the correlation with human scoring and the actual LLM scoring through something like BERT score, BLUE, or Rouge, very common automated scores, do not actually correlate well. So here we're looking for 1.0 would be perfect correlation, 0 is no correlation at all, -1 is perfectly negatively correlated. We found that it's really always kind of around 0, maybe it goes up to 0.3, maybe it goes up to 0.5. I want to be clear here that I'm not saying that LLMs aren't good at medical summarization. I'm saying we don't even know if LLMs are good at medical summarization. We're using a score that is not at all grounded in what we expect it to be and what we might expect, what we might think humans might do as well. So I'm calling for we need to have more clear metrics. Otherwise, we could have a wildly overblown or unreasonably pessimistic view of LLM capabilities. Right now, we're purely flying blind. With my remaining, the time really just flies by. Okay, with my remaining time, I want to talk about a different kind of evaluation that we're interested in. So here's an example I put into GPT-4o. The doctor wants to hire the secretary because she is blank. And as you might imagine, the LLM assumes that the she refers to the secretary. If you flip the gender of the pronoun, because he is, the LLM assumes that you're referring now to the doctor. This is an example of bias in co-reference resolution, which is not so important for the purposes of linguistics analysis, but more important to sort of shed light in the fact that there might be many different kinds of disparate impact on different subpopulations through something like open-ended generation. We see this as well in things like racial bias when LLMs are also asked about race-based medicine and how that might differ. As someone who's worked a lot on bias audits in the past, I can tell you that large language models are a whole different ballgame. No longer are we looking at defined groups that we're interested in and defined outputs that we can evaluate over. Instead, we're looking at free text inputs, so small changes in the wording can have huge effects. We're looking at free text outputs, so bias in how they explain it to you, whether or not the large language model is kind and generous, or if it's being more hard on you. Similarly, if you push enter a bunch of times because you don't like the output, it's stochastic, and it could change many times, making it harder to evaluate in a one-shot setting. There is also no longer a correct answer, similar to the medical summarization task. There might be many different things that might be all right, we're not quite sure. And then lastly, evaluation is research intensive. I want to hone in that we were looking for scalable oversight methods, and it is not immediately obvious how we might go about this. We did a review of all of the different LLM bias evaluations in the landscape, and they really sort of focus on this upper left quadrant, which is a structured output and an explicit group that you're analyzing. And instead, in work that's currently under review, we've expanded this dramatically. How can we think about more creatively about the subgroups that we're interested in and the ways all the bias can manifest? And specifically in this work, which is under review, we go through common actual deployments right now, for example, drafting replies to patient portal messages, and we outline all of the different ways that we can think of right now that bias might manifest. It's not an exhaustive search by any means, but all of the ways that we think right now and how we might go about doing evaluation metrics that would be appropriate right now. All right, 1 minute left. I'm hoping that I've planted a little seed so that when you see numbers like the US medical licensing exam performance for LLMs going up, we saw that earlier today in the lovely keynote. We've seen, I know that Ahmed Allah's talk also mentioned a little bit on the evaluation as well, but I want to emphasize that we want scalable approaches. We don't want to have to call up all our clinician friends and say, does this LLM output good? Is that LLM output good? But it would be nice to know when it is useful or when it is not. And I would argue right now we are flying quite blind. The second is that the whole point of these algorithms is they want to help people. So we want to make sure that we're keenly aware of what kinds of people are being advantaged or disadvantaged by these automated approaches. The hope, as I'm open the talk talking about health equity, and I really do believe that we have an opportunity here to be able to prioritize people, but it's not going to happen accidentally. And then the last thing is, ultimately, we want to make sure that we're focusing on real data, real use cases, and real impact. And I think that's at the heart of what computation precision health is all about. Thank you.
Our final speaker today is Hugo Campos, who is a patient advocate, a member of the Strategic Advisory Board for the UCSF and UC Berkeley Program in Computational Precision Health, and a member of all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, AJ. Thanks, everyone, and appreciate being here. Thank you for including me in this important conversation. I'm a patient, and it's funny, we started the day talking about sudden cardiac death and implantable defibrillators, and now you get to hear from a patient with an implantable defibrillator. I'm also a caregiver to a 95-year-old. My dad lives with us, and I've been using AI for quite a bit, generative AI specifically, since the GPT 3.5 came out in November of 2022, mostly for my care and for my dad's care. But I am also, okay, well, that was the first slide. But I'm also a romantic, so I'm going to tell you a little bit of a story of a doctor from my childhood. You're looking at Dr. Simonard. Dr. Simonard was our family doctor when I was growing up. And when somebody got sick in my house, my mom would pick up the phone and call his house, and his wife would answer the phone and schedule a house call. And he'd live down the street from us, and he would just walk over and sometimes see my mom or my grandma, and sometimes stay for a cup of coffee, sit on a couch, etc. This is the kind of relationship that we had with him, and it was a very close relationship, grounded on trust, familiarity, and care. Today, my relationship with healthcare is much different. Healthcare is a lot less personal. The doctor-patient relationship that was once intimate is now transactional. The doctor became a provider. A patient is now a consumer of healthcare. I was part of that kind of movement. And we transformed what was once a humanistic discipline into a corporatized system. And as a result, healthcare feels broken. I think it feels even, I should say, I feel like I can say oppressive even to both doctors and patients. Doctors are burning out with poor work-life balance. And we expect to see a shortage of 86,000 physicians by 2036. In addition to all of this, there has been a loss of trust in institutions, and it's in decline. And healthcare is no exception. The COVID-19 pandemic was a major turning point, and today trust in healthcare still is low. Institutions that were once pillars of truth, like the NIH, the CDC, academic centers, are under attack and viewed with suspicion and skepticism. And I never thought I would live to see the day, but we're at a point where even the secretary of HHS publicly questions the efficacy of vaccines. So who do we trust? Do we trust the human, or do we trust the algorithm? And I asked Open Evidence if vaccines cause autism, and it answered no, and it gave me a list of references. And in this case, the answer to this question may be easy for a group of scientists and doctors, but it may not always be easy for everybody. Right? In this case, it's an easy answer. It may be hard sometimes to know which is true. So the point of this slide is to really say that I think it's this day and age, it's really important that we flex our critical thinking muscles, particularly patients and people using these tools, if we hope to make wise decisions. And I always tell other patients, I say, now the burden is on us. It's on you. You can't just delegate. You must do your homework. And this is, I think, where AI, and this is ironic, but I think that's where AI can really be powerful and in the hands of patients. So I think going forward, health literacy will have to be about knowing how to challenge information critically, how to prompt the AI, how to partner with doctors and AI. I think this is really important. We've heard all day today. We heard mostly AI used in the clinical setting or used on the side of the health system. But what if we use AI to help patients be a little higher up in terms of information asymmetry and power imbalances in order to be able to better partner with their clinicians and do some of the jobs that doctors are so pressed and having trouble keeping up with clinicians in general. So the good news is that patients are starting to realize this and see the potential of AI to address some of these gaps. In particular, I want to say e-patient Dave, I skipped that, so sorry. I got confused. E-patient Dave DeBroncard, the world-leading patient advocate, has been blogging about how patients have been using AI for a while. And he tells a story of how I used AI to help diagnose and treat a skin condition in my 95-year-old dad. Like I said, my dad lives with us, and I'm his caregiver. And I'm not going to go into all the details here, but the story is really about how I used AI to help diagnose and treat the skin rash when the appointment with the dermatologist was 4 months away, and we couldn't wait. And he was complaining, it was uncomfortable, and we had no choice. I would rather see a dermatologist, but that was not an option for us. So we used AI. I asked AI to look, I used a variety of models. I had some of the models look at the photos. I fed it the clinical notes from a recent visit with the PCP. I fed it also the blood test results. And I asked for it to provide a table of differential diagnosis and potential interventions so that we could take some action while we waited. And lo and behold, the AI did solve the problem. In just a couple of weeks, his skin did clear. And eventually the diagnosis of xerotic dermatitis was confirmed by the dermatologist. But AI was the only one that pointed out a link between my dad's rash and his chronic kidney disease. And one of the interventions that we decided to do on our own was to switch to a renal-friendly diet. And this is not something that the PCP brought up, or the dermatologist. The dermatologist had no access to his blood test results. So the dermatologist is not even set up to win. So patients have to step in, and because the system is stretched too thin. And also another example here, which is something that I'm dealing with right at the moment. The battery of my implantable defibrillator is approaching end of life, and I'm due for a replacement. I have a surgery scheduled for next month. But the brand that I like and I trust, and that's the device that I've had for the last 18 years, is not in rotation, as the clinic calls it. And they say they don't have a contract with that vendor at the moment. They have a dual vendor contract with 2 other manufacturers. And I have to pick from the 2 manufacturers. In fact, depending on which day of the week I have the surgery, I'll get either one or the other. So they alternate every other week. So there's no clinical rationale, just a contractual reason for us to, I may end up committing to an implantable device that's going to sit in my body for the next 10 years just because of contractual reasons. No clinical explanation was ever given. So here I am in this really difficult position to have to make a clinical argument to justify my preference to a team of experts, to cardiac electrophysiologists who do this all day and for years and years and years. How do I do that? I don't have a chance. I'm a patient. And so, but thankfully there's AI. And I think it's my partner in crime, right? So better yet, now there are some great tools that are available. I'm wrapping up. So there are tools that are available like reasoning models and research assistants that can help me make sense of this. And this is a complex problem, and I broke it into smaller tasks. And I assigned it to different AI tools and pulled the results out and fed it into Gemini Advanced with deep research. And it generated a 30-page report that I used for my analysis and to vet the information with reps from a few manufacturers just to make sure I'm on the right track. So quick education in cardiac rhythm management. So we'll see where that leads. And I don't know where that will lead. But I want to point out something that I think it's important. I often hear folks concerned about patient use of AI and how AI hallucinates and stuff. And I think it's important to notice that patients and doctors use AI in fundamentally different ways. We can't assume that just because one thing is true for one group that it will apply to the other. I think doctors use AI that's assigned to them by the institution. They're bound by legal, regulatory, and compliance rules. And even though patients like me have also faced some limitations, we have cost limitations, AI literacy, a lack of access to health data. That's a really big hurdle. We're not bound by the same constraints as doctors. I'm free to do whatever I want and use these tools however I wish, whenever I wish, as long as I am willing to accept the risks. So I think there is a real chance from what I look. I may be mistaken. Hopefully not. Hopefully I am mistaken, I should say. But I think there is a chance that AI may end up constraining doctors further, taking away further their autonomy and liberating patients. So giving patients more flexibility and freedom and the ability to better partner with doctors. There's no going back to the days of Dr. Simonard. The doctor at that time, unfortunately, is over, is gone. But so is the patient. I think, ironically, AI may help us reclaim a sense of agency. Sorry for doctors. I don't think that's going to be the case for doctors. I'm sorry to say. But I think for patients, it may help folks reclaim a sense of agency and choice. So in a world of fewer doctors and fading trust and more complexity, I think generative AI can be a game changer in the hands of patients. With one caveat, I think patients really need to think critically, learn how to use these tools creatively, and take the lead in their own care. I hope I mentioned everything I wanted to. Thank you for your time and attention.
To the rest of the conference, we'll do a few questions. This is a sort of moderated panel discussion, and then we'll turn it over to the audience for some Q&A, and you'll get a chance to ask some of our fantastic speakers the burning questions that I'm sure you're excited to ask. This question really can be for anyone on the panel, but I really wrote it for Hugo in mind, which is, as more and more AI tools are deployed into clinical care, what are the best practices? How can we assure patients that they're being used safely and responsibly, given that there are so many things working in the background? And that right now we seem to have this world where if you're using an AI scribe, you need to tell the patient and consent them in the clinic as they begin their visit. But there are all sorts of AI-driven clinical decision support or monitoring tools operating in the background that most patients are probably completely unaware of. And so I'd be curious, as a patient advocate, what are your thoughts on what is the right amount of information to disclose to patients, when to just reassure them that, their data, their sensitive information is sort of being handled in a manner that is professional and, responsible?
Wow. Okay. So there's a lot packed in there. So a priori, I expect that my doctors will sign off of any tools that they use. So I expect that anybody who's using AI in a clinical setting will use it safely. That's the expectation. Now, I think AI should be the patient should be made aware that AI is being used. Always, in particular when the AI was used to help with some clinical decision or an intervention, guide an intervention, or do something that may have consequences in the outcome of the patient. So, I think it should be proactive. We should. I expect folks to say. To say we used AI for this, we used AI for that, I forgot. I lost my train of thought. So it's important to, but reactive as well. But well, it's if the patient asks. This is what I wanted to say. If the patient asks if AI was used, I think it's we should not make a secret of it.
Absolutely. I think it's interesting that we probably do the opposite right now, where we disclose an AI scribe, which is just sort of taking away an administrative task. But the fact that like the Epic Deterioration Index for inpatient hospitalized patients is running in the background is probably not well disclosed to patients, or at least not in a format. If it is, it's in like one of those really long terms and conditions you just click yes on no matter what, which I think is a really challenging aspect of this type of work.
I'd like to add one more thing, which is that it's not enough to just tell the patient that you're using AI. In my dream world, the patients inform how the AI does as well. And so something that we're dipping our toes into is thinking about things like incident reporting, or sort of like as the patients go through the hospital system or interact with AI, wouldn't it be great if they could also say, I don't love how this thing talked to me. I don't really like this particular way of responding, both feedback to the clinician, but also feedback to the model developers themselves. And you can imagine a more tight feedback loop rather than sort of being handed down AI tools from some model developer somewhere in a windowless room.
Yeah, I think I'll echo that point as well. I have a grant with PCORI, so it's very patient-centered, and I have patient focus groups as part of that. And so we're developing AI algorithms, but every 6 months or so, we go back to patient groups and ask them like, oh, what feedback do you have for us? And I think that has been a really informative experience. And I think in the future, I think that feedback loop should be kind of better integrated as well.
Fantastic. So I think you probably convinced everyone in this room with your presentations today that AI evaluations are critically important, and we need to be doing them at a pretty ongoing basis. The question I have is, what are the hallmarks of a successful AI evaluation? Which is to say, does it need to be done locally, or can we trust, products that have some sort of stamp of approval from an AI center of excellence? What are the outcomes that we really care about? Do we need to measure model performance, or is measuring an outcome that it's sensitive to good enough? And so I'm curious what would sort of look like an ideal state, and also have you seen in practice a really successful AI evaluation platform or framework?
There's so many questions wrapped up in that. I'll try to answer the ones I remember, which is sort of like, what are good evaluations? Are they here? Are they there? And in my head, it's like a Swiss cheese method is what they call it. So it's not, I'm not saying that we need great evaluations that are robust and they generalize and they never ever can be fooled. But I am saying LLMs are being used and AI is used widely enough that it would be great if we had checks along the way to see, Jean's presentation about monitoring, that it's roughly performing as well as we expect over time. Or as new technologies develop, we think that it probably isn't going to be as bad, any worse than the previous one. And also looking at the patient outcomes, there aren't any egregious cases that we need to sort of have a whole sort of debugging process of sort of incident reporting, working backwards what happened there. And so my hope is that as we have greater literacy, I would say, around AI, what it can do, what it can't do, what the benefits are, et cetera, we can start to have different gates or different checks to be able to collectively in aggregate be more confident in that. I'm curious what the other panelists think.
Yeah, sure. I don't know if I've seen an AI evaluation framework that I'm like completely confident, like super comprehensive. But I guess like one thing that our group is doing right now is just like looking at kind of the summary reports of validation studies for FDA approved AI medical devices. And it's quite interesting because I think to get something approved by the FDA, you have to do pretty extensive testing, definitely much more than what you typically do in research. And they'll think about stuff like unit tests or just like very engineering specific tests that don't actually pop up a lot in the research side. And so there's all these suites of tests that actually do happen. But then there are certain tests where you're like, well, the research world could inform how we can do better validation as well. It's like, well, you only validated at one site. Is that really sufficiently generalizable? And on the researchers have found like, okay, well, we need to evaluate for subgroups. We need multiple sites, maybe even monitoring. Monitoring is rarely even mentioned in these types of documents. So I think there's still a lot to be learned from both sides. Yeah, so we have a ways to go probably.
I don't know that I'm an expert to offer any insights in here, but it seems reasonable to me that it would be evaluated both in sort of in a bigger, more sort of global, centralized, I suppose, way and localized way, since the populations can be unique and people can be, I don't know. It's the U.S. is a diverse country, and so that's what it seems reasonable to me.
It's great because that leads directly into my sort of next discussion question, which is another I think challenging one to really get at. But I think many of us in this audience are really worried about, we talk a lot about the importance of continuous monitoring in AI and health systems should invest in this type of work. But what about for places that are more resource constrained compared to a UCSF or a Stanford or a Kaiser, who are going to really struggle, whether that's through just having enough money or being in a labor market where hiring a bunch of folks with the title of data scientist is going to be a real challenge. So are there sort of strategies that you've seen at sort of less well-resourced organizations that are interested in AI adoption? Or if not, are there anything that you can think of on the policy or regulatory environment that might push some of those or help them in doing those types of really complex evaluations that are quite frankly expensive?
Okay, so just recently ZSFG, I'm like the data science lead of a group that's in charge of like a digital innovation at ZSFG. And we recently held a safety net AI symposium where we brought together a bunch of safety net hospitals across the US. I guess like there were like 5 or 6 of them. We were talking about like what were the challenges we were facing to actually like deploy AI. No, we weren't even talking about monitoring. It's like, can we even like buy these AI systems? Like certain hospitals are just like, we don't have the money. And they try to sign contracts with these companies, but then the companies are not necessarily going to decrease prices just because you're a safety net hospital. And so like a lot of the things that we heard were like, we want to find a vendor where we can just trust them and then they can give us multiple models rather than like, a safety net hospital doesn't have the bandwidth to like pay for one model from one company and go to another vendor and buy another model. And given all these constraints, people were also talking about like, well, we might actually just follow the lead of well-resourced hospitals, see what they're doing, let them test it out, and then we'll follow behind. We're like okay with being like a bit slower, as long as we're not paying as much up front. But those raise a bunch of questions as well, like are these companies actually going to design AI systems that are suitable for these populations? So I think there's a lot of open questions. I think one solution that we're trying to think through is just like, how do we build some sort of network together so that we can make our voices heard?
Yeah, I'm actually going to ask Gina a question about that, which is how do you do that? Like, that seems incredibly hard to, I guess, when you have limited resources, like, can you be able to get, what's going on there?
So I think like the one really nice part was I guess the symposium was hosted by like funded by America's Essential Hospitals. So that at least has like some amount of funding such that they can bring together these hospitals, also lobby for them, help inform policymakers, like what do you need to do for these hospitals? Because they serve such a wide swath of the American population. So I don't know. The hope is working together. Maybe something will come out of it.
Very cool.
Absolutely, really fantastic. And I think that's something that concerns many of us. And I know, back in the era of EHR adoption, ONC had a regional extension center program where they put, trained boots on the ground folks to help rural hospitals that had a hard time hiring, talented IT staff. And I think given the current federal environment, the appetite for that is likely low, but it's certainly something that states like California should think about exploring, where, the state could hire data scientists to do evaluation or to help them with the implementation of this type of AI in areas where they're going to really struggle to build up the workforce to do that in the first place. All right, our last question is really thinking about the distributional impacts of AI. And as we go into this world of post-adoption monitoring and looking at things, who really benefits from an intervention is always one of the most difficult things to really tease out about any sort of health intervention. And AI is another big one because, some of the concerns that I think we have is, what if this AI algorithm works perfect on 99% of patients, but that 1% of patients are, a subgroup or folks with limited English proficiency or something about them. And we know from much of the psychology literature that humans are pretty bad at, a technology that works 99.9% of the time, identifying and being vigilant over that 0.1%. Is there anything, in all of the work that you've done on looking at what sort of monitoring platforms they have, and Irene, on your sort of distributional impacts, that looks at sort of the human factor? What if we get a little bit too reliant on this AI and it has big consequences for small subgroups of patients, even if we raise 99% of all boats, that 1% that falls really concerns us?
The way I think of it is that AI can help with many, many things. We often tend to think of it as clinical decision-making, automating pesky clinicians, and we can just sort of have a perfect world out there. And I'm very skeptical, and I really worry about what that world looks like. But there's also a world where we use AI to better understand our current world. So for example, we're looking at patients who have medical conditions who can't see doctors for whatever reason, and then they tweet about it. They put it on social media. Can we understand what their what their health issues are in a way that then allows researchers to better understand different conditions? And I think that there's a real opportunity here to start to collect a lot of different voices who may not be in clinical trials, who may not be in electronic health records, and see if we can start to learn from that as well. This, of course, all relies on the fact that they're measurable in the first place, that they're online, that they're sort of willing to share their information in this way. And so, caveat, but I'm optimistic that the way that AI can start to handle different data types and even transcribe conversations that you have with your doctor so that your doctor can be hands-free and sort of have more direct contact. All of those things I'm hoping will start to march towards a future where we can have more people represented and learned about through this process. So I would say I'm less excited about let's just automate all clinical decision-making, and I'm more, can we use AI to be curious about the people that we thought we knew everything about already?
I guess the other aspect is we have monitoring systems in place that could potentially help us find those subgroups. The thing that I'm a bit unsure about is what exists monitoring wise, at the FDA right now, is you have a drug or a device that goes out and then people report adverse events. And eventually there's enough of them where someone decides to step in and say okay, there's a subgroup that's experiencing particularly bad outcomes. But that was all under the assumption that this drug will probably work for everyone, or this device probably works for everyone. And that works well for drugs or kind of traditional devices where those impacts tend to generalize. And AI algorithms are a bit different. We know our prior is that they don't generalize. So there is a question of do existing monitoring frameworks actually apply? So I don't know. One option is, I guess you could say maybe you want a gradual rollout, do some sort of beta testing for people who you're really unsure about, maybe have the clinician do more hand holding and kind of, and then when you're confident enough, you can switch over to the AI system. But I think these things are still research questions that need to be figured out.
Fantastic. I think we have a little bit of time to take a few questions from the audience. Yes, right behind you.
Oh, yes.
Okay. Hey, I'm Rebecca. Thanks, everyone. So particularly for Hugo, I just wanted to thank you. You know, I spent most of the day in my work brain, and then you kind of put me in my patient brain where I was like, I was trying to get an inhaler the other day and I had to like make 3 appointments and call 4 different people. Like, come on. And I'm wondering, you know, if and how you've seen people actually get patients access to either the data or the models that they need to be empowered. Because, you know, if you have, and this, like in Ziad's talk earlier, and everyone throughout the day is talking about, hey, if we've like got these models, can we put them in the hands of patients? Definitely. But in order, like, you need your own features, right? Like, you need to be able to run inference on your own data. So how, have you seen any cases where people have the ability to do that?
Yeah, thank you so much for that question. There's a lot I want to address there. The access to data is the biggest challenge. It's the biggest barrier for patients. The way I've been doing it is by pulling PDFs, and I have to OCR the PDFs. Sometimes I convert them to text. A lot is lost in that. I don't know what the model can see and what it cannot. It's really difficult to really. There's no FHIR or what is HL7 or some way to kind of plug the AI straight into a data pipe of some sort, or an API. So that's a huge barrier for patients for empowerment. The other thing that occurred to me as you're asking the question is that I don't know that I actually trust. It may be obvious already that I have a chip on my shoulder, but it's that I would trust a health system to be able to build AI that will work for me. I actually don't trust that. You know, it's like where we started talking about ambient AI to help doctors write the clinical note. And all of a sudden, the conversation is no longer about the clinical note. It's about the billable note, because that's what we care about. Efficiency. So that doctor that sees 22 patients a day can see 30. And so it's when does that end? And so we already don't have enough doctors and clinicians, and people are tired of the profession. So how do we bring the joy back to the practice of medicine, and how do we liberate patients in a way? So I have this dream that patients will be able to have their own sandbox where we can bring our own data and run our own models. I know to your point. There is a patient advocate, the former founder of ACOR, a cancer organization, a patient advocate, who is running his own models in his own computers at home. So folks are doing it, and we may not be informaticians or mathematicians and statisticians and all the other difficult, complicated topics, experts in these areas, but we're doing our best when there isn't an option.
Sorry, I didn't see your hand.
It's Jen in the back.
Oh, Jen. Hi.
This is more of a commentary than it is a question. Sorry, Irene. I know we have a lot of emphasis on sort of retrospective analyses and sort of like that's in terms of evaluation. But I think one of the difficulties with clinical evaluations of AI models is that it's not just that the models are evolving, but the clinical evidence is also evolving very quickly. And in a lot of my own personal work, we develop models, but then a year later, the underlying knowledge base for the models have already changed because of either changes in terminology or new drugs or new processes of care that have superseded them. And so I guess like the question out of this for the panel is like, why aren't we just doing empirical tests and trying things and seeing what happens with some safeguards next to it? And one example I'll give is that I use ambient scribes a lot in my practice. And for the longest time, I thought that they were not applicable for non-English encounters. But, yesterday I decided to say, screw it, I'm just going to do an encounter in Chinese. and just see what happens if the ambient scribe. And they actually did a pretty darn good job at transcribing everything. And so I guess like wouldn't the better way to evaluate things is to just try and find out, you know?
I support that. I think focusing on not even clinical outcomes, but clinical impact, I think is the best way to be grounded. I will say that from like as you go up the model development pipeline, there is tremendous advantage to having each iteration loop be 2 seconds to see, oh, does this work? Does this not work? Versus 2 years of like, okay, let's ship it. Let's get it into UCSF. Let's ask Jin how he feels about it and then come back in 6 months. And so I think there's room for both, I would say. And there should be both.
I guess also like, I think the philosophy of trying it and testing it out makes a lot of sense if you're critical about it. Like if you just take a thing and then start using it in blind faith, that wouldn't make sense. But I yeah, just like Irene, I support the try and test it out philosophy.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I think that's our time. So we're going to wrap up this session. Thank you all for being here and enjoy your rest of your week.